Yes, I'm thrilled that we're both wearing flannel shirts.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yes, it's funny. I actually wore this same thing yesterday, and my client had a red flannel shirt on, and at the very beginning of session, as soon as I saw him, I was like, I trust you got the red flannel memo. Thank you very much. Like, I love it.
But we're wearing red and blue. It's a nice contrast.
It is. It's like the 3D glasses from the 80s, right? I over here it's um kind of dreary. It's overcast. What's the weather like where you are?
Um, it's overcast, but I'm so excited about doing this that it doesn't seem dreary at all.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. I love the enthusiasm. Um, okay, well, so let's jump into it. So
Sure.
Jonathan, you go by Jonathan. What would you like me to call you?
Jonathan, a lot of people call me John. I have a slight preference for Jonathan, but
Okay.
you slip into John and it's totally okay.
No, I've been corrected when, I have Pamelas and Pams, and then I call someone Pam and they're like, it's Pamela. I'm like, okay, all right.
I'm
So,
not going to correct you.
well, I'll try. I'll try and remember Jonathan. So
Uh,
let's jump. Yeah, go ahead.
there's absolutely no reason to put any effort into that whatsoever. Trust me. I'm very
Okay.
comfortable with John. If you forget, it's totally fine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I share your enthusiasm and excitement. I'm really appreciative that you wanted to come on the show, and it's funny because when I got your response, I recognized your name. I don't even remember when I wrote this article out, but I wrote some blog article and haven't often posted in listservs. But it was one of the ones that was less psychotherapy focused and more maybe politically focused. And that was a no-no. May have been in violation of the group rules or
Good for
policy.
you.
but you were very positive and very supportive, and I that meant a lot to me, especially as someone who has at that point had little to no readership or audience, and it was just it was a noticeable boost of support. So when you said yes, I was like, I know Jonathan Lebolt. Am I pronouncing your last name correct? Is it Lebolt?
Incredibly, you are pronouncing it correctly. That is very rare, Roman.
Is it? What do you usually get?
When I say always, like 99% of the time, it's Lebolt, which it kind of looks like.
Oh, right.
But it's an Ellis Island name. It's not Lebolt. It's Leibowitz.
Right.
And I don't mind if people say Lebolt, but it's delightful that you guessed correctly.
Yeah, I was a lucky guess. So they think it's French, Lebolt, right? Something like.
Not only do they think they start capitalizing it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That irritates me a little bit.
Oh, they capitalized the B
Yes.
on you. You're
But
like, I didn't.
I'll type I'll type it with a small b, and they'll change it into a capital B.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny what people do. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you since we're in person now. I mean, well, in person, but face to face, synchronously. So I appreciate that support from whenever, I don't know, years ago. And I think it would be good for folks to just know a little bit about you. I want to start by just letting my organic curiosity follow me. I'm always curious when I speak to folks who are fellow clinicians in the field, even fellow instructors, faculty, like when did you get bit by the therapy bug or the psychology bug, or what was your interests in middle school, high school? Take me through that.
So I don't think I was interested in it in middle school or high school. I thought that I wanted to be a writer, like my mom. It was when I was a young adult, and I love my mother, but she was are we allowed to use curses on this?
Yeah, you can say any damn word you want.
She was a wonderful woman, but she was very fucked up, and there was a lot of abuse in my family.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not surprising that as a young adult, I developed a rather serious depression. And I had tried some therapists that weren't helpful, and I'd given up on therapy. And at some point, I realized I really need to try it again. And I saw a therapist who was so helpful that I thought, I want to do this for other people. You know, I want to help other people who are depressed. I want to help them take their lives back. Um, so it was really out of the crucible of pain that I developed the desire to become a therapist.
Mm. Yeah, I've heard that story numerous times, you know, in like graduate programs or when people say like, you know, what got you into this work? And many people often say, or it's not uncommon for people to say, I was a client and I was so moved or so healed or so transformed that I wanted to stop my financial banking or whatever it is, real estate, you know, and go into the field. And so that was for you. And you said you went into your first therapist was as a young adult, like in your early 20s.
I saw some therapists in my late teens that were really not helpful, but I at some point I consulted a therapist who really was helpful and really helped me through a very difficult time. And you know, you were just saying a moment ago that you've heard this story before, and I very firmly believe that we're all wounded healers.
Oh yeah.
And I think this tradition goes back thousands of years to prehistoric shamans
Yes.
who were people who either had wounds or developed wounds in the process of their training. And I remember I've taught in a lot of graduate social work programs, mostly in New York and Virginia, and I still remember I still remember in one of the classes I was teaching, and I'm also a group therapist, so I try to get students involved as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I was having students share about their background, and some of the students made it sound like there were no problems in their childhood.
Oh yes.
And and I was like, I don't think so. But I tried to be respectful and open-minded and say, I'm used to I'm used to us being wounded healers, but I have to open my mind up to the possibility that you didn't have such a childhood. And not everybody has trauma with a capital T the way I did.
Mm-hmm.
But word is still out. I'm skeptical that those students didn't do some of their own work as they became therapists themselves. And I'm skeptical that they didn't find out that things were less rosy in their childhood than they thought it had been.
Yeah, well, totally. And Jonathan, I mean, it's like when someone comes in, they're like, even like so you're familiar with the comedian Bill Maher?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, yeah. So he talks about his childhood. He's like, I had a very Leave It to Beaver childhood, right? It's like so I don't know. I can't remember how old he is, but like people have certain levels of insight or awareness or how they conceptualize wounds, right? They might say like, oh, like let me give you an example. Like for me, when I entered into my grad program, I was that buyer persona, that that personality. It was like I was so lucky to have loving parents. They're still together, all that stuff. And I'm totally on the other side of it in the camp of wounded healer. And because of how we, I guess maybe two reasons. One, how do we conceptualize what is a wound? What rises to the threshold of, okay, that's a real wound or a large enough, significant enough wound that it's actually still unprocessed and it's still being carried into the present and influencing the way I show up among many contexts. And then the second thing would just be access or remembering what happened. Right. So obviously there's that function of like, oh, I don't remember a lot of it. So therefore what I do remember was all great,
Yeah, and part of what helps us survive is repressing or suppressing memories. And I'm a psychoanalyst, and I've worked with a lot of patients who start seeing me and describe these rosy childhoods, and they start remembering. And this is very different from, I don't know if you remember some decades back, the whole idea of recovered memories, and
Oh
where
yeah.
therapists were inducing their
Yeah.
patients and suggesting that trauma happened when it might not have occurred. But people really don't remember stuff, and as they start delving into their past, they start remembering things. And none of us have perfect parents. We're all human beings, and our parents do the best that they can, and that can be hurtful, harmful, or both. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. What I meant to say was it can be. What I meant to say was that parents can be parents can foster a good enough, healthy environment, um, but they can be harmful too.
That's right. Yeah, they can be loving, they can be on point, nurturing, and encouraging caregivers, and they can also um, unintentionally or perhaps malevolently, it depends on how terrible the line of ancestral intergenerational trauma is, right? But yeah, they can do some real damage. And also, you know, let it not be lost on our listeners that like getting wounded as an adult feels different than getting wounded as a child. I mean, children are very vulnerable. Not to get too nerdy and scientific, but like the little ones need the right environment. Like in a creek, like fish can't lay egg, like insect larva doesn't survive unless things are actually healthy. Like it's a good marker of health when like eggs can live and babies can survive. And so kids are very sensitive and very vulnerable and need like that kind of positive and loving support. And no one's perfect. And so the human condition, I'm sure you'll agree with me, is to be dysregulated and have color with all the colors of different emotions. And the little ones, that they get hurt the most. And
Oh,
so
absolutely.
no one's immune, no one's exempt from this, really.
No, and even the healthiest of families have harm, and we're all human beings and we're all flawed. And then of course there's intergenerational transmission of trauma, and we psychoanalysts certainly believe that the earliest years are the most vulnerable and most formative. Um, but I've also learned that adult trauma can be very, very profound,
Mm-hmm.
and even when one hasn't had a capital T trauma background as a child, and in contemporary psychoanalysis, we know that events have a profound impact throughout the lifespan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that adults don't get wounded and don't have sensitivities as well. Just comparing like an
Oh yeah.
adult an adult to a child. I mean, children just by their nature are smaller and more vulnerable, you know.
Oh, absolutely. I agree
Yeah.
100%. I didn't hear you at all dismissing adult
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
It's just something when you train as an analyst, so I did my bachelor's and my master's and my doctorate, and then I did my analytic training. It's a lot of years, and
Yeah.
I did my training back in the 90s, and at that time there wasn't as much knowledge about how profound the impact of adult trauma could be. It was all seen through the filter of what you experienced in your very early years, which, as you and I seem to be in agreement, have the most profound impact. But, I think I've learned from my patients that they don't necessarily have to have had a very traumatic background in their childhood for the adult trauma to have a very profound impact.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I also appreciate what you referenced, Jonathan, just about like wounded healers. I mean, that I don't remember when that phrase first came across my ears, but I totally agree with it. And going back to prehistory, yeah, it's a long tradition of like the nerd in me goes to like Final Fantasy games, or if you're in D&D and like you have black magic and white magic, and the white magic is the magic that heals. The white magic is the magic that can restore and renew and transform. And it is a I don't think I certainly there are some professionals that don't necessarily um, connect to that lineage. That's just there's just like, well, I'm not a doctor. I'm don't consider myself a doctor of the heart or of the soul. I'm just a psychotherapist. I help people identify dysfunctional behaviors, and I want to help them learn coping strategies and achieve their goals, which are measurable. And you know, and give them a. My point being is that
I can explain to you why I'm groaning.
Yeah, no, go for
You're
it. Go for
curious.
it.
Well, it's just, this is the age of managed care where insurance companies want treatment to be as short as possible. And short-term treatment can be very helpful. And not
Yeah,
everybody wants to do long-term treatment. And certainly we live in a society with huge income inequities where not everybody's able to do long-term treatment.
that's right.
But the groan was that, and I wasn't hearing you prescribe short-term treatment, but the groan was the push for quick fixes
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that that we as human beings, that our emotions and our motivations can be operationalized, and that therapy can be manualized. And this is not a criticism of you, but you were speaking to a particular kind of therapist. But even imagining this therapist saying, "I'm just a therapist," and I would never use the word "just"
Mm-hmm.
with a therapist. Again, it's not a criticism of you. Like, even if you're not as into depth work as I am, um, we therapists are just doing so much.
Yeah.
And I hadn't realized before the interview that you were also a social worker, a therapist, both.
So I'm a marriage and family therapist, but
Wonderful.
but these days I've been telling people, like, when I fill out my like on the paperwork and it says occupation, I reluctantly put psychotherapist these days. And my wife is like, don't let your license lapse until you have like stabilized, income, cash flow stuff. But like, I conceptually feel more like a spiritual healer than a psychotherapist. So
Wow,
yeah.
that's wonderful. And you'll be very interested to know, if I'm remembering correctly,
Mhm.
the first one to use the phrase wounded healer was Henry Nouwen. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
How do you spell his last name?
Nouwen, which I think is a
Mm,
Dutch spelling. And
okay, no, yeah, no, it doesn't ring a bell. Yeah.
I think he was a Catholic theologian, and I believe he was the first one to use that phrase.
Mm,
Even though, of course, the phenomenon has existed for millennia, as we were discussing.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah. So let me ask you something. I'm going to take a brief off ramp, and then we'll come back onto this main highway. I bookmarked something when you talked about your first experiences as a teen, and you said that wasn't very helpful. And I feel like
oh no.
the audience, the audience is different ages, genders, professions, but I feel like it'll be helpful for listeners to say a little bit about what you found wasn't helpful as a teen.
I'm happy to talk about my terrible therapy experiences, because there really are a lot of terrible therapists out there who cause a lot of harm. Now I've learned over the years that there's also a lot of good therapists out there too.
Mhm.
But I think it's to my credit that I never gave up, because I had a lot of bad experiences. And I guess whoever is listening to this, if you've had bad experiences, don't give up. I mean, I'm meeting with a patient now who's had a lot of bad therapy experiences, and she didn't give up. And I've just really affirmed her courage and her strength. And she has her misgivings about me, and I affirmed that. I said,
Yeah,
"You don't know me. I may just have pretty words. Don't trust me until you trust me, and I'm
that's
still
right.
a human being, and I'm still gonna fuck up."
Hmm. That's right. Yeah, the trust has to be earned, and
Yes.
and that's right. When people have bad experiences, unhelpful experiences, they bring that right to the next provider. It's like, well, are you gonna treat me the way the last one did, or are you not gonna take seriously, or are you gonna dismiss? Or, I mean, there's a whole host of ways that us providers can get it wrong. And you're right. There's not competent folks in all fields, and psychotherapy is no exception, right? But I wanted to ask, as your experience.
But I'm happy to circle back to the bad
Yeah,
experiences.
yeah, yeah.
But was that where you were going, or were you going somewhere
That's
else?
exactly where I was
Oh,
going. From
okay.
your perspective as an adolescent, what did you feel what was the therapist doing that they were really getting it wrong?
I'd love to tell you briefly about two experiences.
Yeah.
Um, the first one was when I was 17, And now this is a long time ago. I'm 64 and I'm going to be 65 this year. And thank God for Medicare, and I won't have to pay all that money for insurance. Although I'm grateful to Obamacare for lowering that. But so we're talking about many years ago. So when I was 17 and I started getting depressed, my mother suggested that I see her analyst, because she was seeing an analyst at that time, and that wasn't as unusual then. Now it's more unusual. But analysis was in its heyday then. And her analyst was just such a stereotype. He was this, and you may be able to tell that I'm very different from the stereotype of an analyst, even to some extent of today's analysts. So he was this, here I am, this 17-year-old boy, and he's this, I'd say he's probably about my age. A portly guy sitting there puffing on a cigar, another stereotype.
Perfect, right.
And, of course, now, you wouldn't smoke in front of a patient, but, back then everybody smoked, but not everybody smoked cigars. So he's smoking a cigar, and he'd given me a questionnaire to take home. And it has these really sexist questions on it. This is back in the 70s. I wish I could say that we've come further than we have. It has questions like, do you like mannish women? And what do you think about women who smoke long cigarettes? And I'm like, this is so fucking sexist.
Yeah.
And I actually came to the second session, and I said, I was a 17-year-old kid, so I wasn't the most, polite or deferential youngster. And I said, this seems kind of sexist to me, questions about managed women. Well, this portly guy puffing on a cigar, he explodes and says, you think that you're sensitive. You think that you're intelligent. It's all a bunch of bullshit. A part of me is laughing about it. I was laughing a moment ago. You have a smile on your face.
Yeah.
But, this was, I
upsetting.
can joke about it now, but I can still feel some of the pain.
Yeah.
And, I left his office in tears. And in fact, I was very sensitive. I wasn't deferential to his patriarchal authority. And, so I left his office in tears, and that started a whole series of therapy consultations that went badly because, my well-intentioned mother asked him for a referral. So who's he going to refer me to? I mean, I'm not saying it was the same experience, but I kept on having these negative experiences, and then we'd say, so who should I go to now? There was no Psychology Today where you could look this up online.
Yeah, right.
There was much more like now some people actually are proud of going to therapy, which I think you should be.
That's correct.
But, back then there was a lot more stigma. You couldn't go to your PCP and ask for a referral. So, at some point I just stopped. But I do remember another interesting experience several years later, which would be more of a young adult's experience. If you'd like me to share it, I'd be happy to.
Well, I'll say I do want you to share it. I just want to reflect the lack of unconditional positive regard, right? that he had. And also, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of distance now from that event, and you rightfully called out the fact that there's smiling and laughing about it. But as you tell the story, it doesn't surprise me that the 17-year-old or however old you were, that part of you still carries pain. Because I mean, you're giving feedback. It's the building rapport, joining phase of therapy, and you're giving your honest take on how you experienced the questionnaire, and it triggers maybe what an analyst would call a defense. In my view, I'm an IFS guy, like purebred IFS, like doggedly IFS. And so the part of him that had whatever feelings that it had every right to have, but I mean, it lashed out at you essentially. So it's not a surprise to me at all that you were
Yeah,
like, well, not going back to that guy.
his protector part persecuted me.
Totally.
I don't know a huge amount about IFS, but I have a great deal of respect for it.
Yeah.
And I see overlap between it and some psychoanalytic approaches to trauma.
Yeah, well, I'll say
Um,
maybe one of the big divergences, and maybe we'll get there, but is I remember like one of the first feedbacks that one of my supervisors gave me in the marriage and family therapy. I graduated from University of Maryland, go Terps, and fall semester, one of the first feedbacks is like, Robin, you're very analytical. You're very analytical, right? Very cognitive, and I've come to learn that in IFS, that part, the part that is very logical, analytical, cognitive, and let's not pretend that it's just one part. It's probably a team of analytical parts, right? That they all dominate a lot of my life and can dominate a lot of when I'm a supervisor or when I'm a clinician. And it's recently, I'd say in the last 12 months, maybe a little longer, but have learned to cultivate a relationship where, and as the client, where that analytical part can relax and separate and make space for more open-hearted, open-minded, not that agenda of kind of figuring out the connections necessarily, right? It just relaxes. So like I said, I'm dog-earing that page ahead of the book in our conversation, but I do want to come back to, go ahead.
Whether we get back to it or not, I must respond to what you just shared,
Oh,
because
please.
I think it's so important to our work. And by the way, I was just really relishing. You're so good at what you're doing with me right now, and 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 yet you're also a therapist and spiritually oriented, and just I'm really enjoying how well-rounded you are as a person.
Oh, thank you.
Um, but getting back to what you were saying, any good therapist, psychoanalytic or otherwise, you're probably encountered this more often with an approach like IFS, but any good therapist or analyst has to be open to letting go of logic,
Mm-hmm.
not knowing, being intuitive, going with their gut. And
Yeah.
in my work and in the work of my mentors, I have a wonderful analyst and two wonderful group therapists. I'm in two training groups for group therapists.
Mm-hmm.
My mentors and I, we use our intuition tremendously in our work. And the idea of needing to let go of knowing, and I'm going to put knowing in quotation marks because knowing is very conditional, is I think quintessential.
Yeah, totally agree. And it springboards just a quick kind of sub question that I want to, if you'll allow me, the notion of when a client is saying something, and let's say you, Jonathan, as the client's talking, your mind is serving up images, sounds, sensations, whatever the phenomenology is, the objects of awareness. To what degree or how often do you use that and then share that with the client and say, as you're talking about that, this image of a boat that's getting pulled down under the water is coming up for me. How often do you share what's coming up for you and with the client in real time?
So I'm so different from the stereotype of the analyst who doesn't answer questions directly and doesn't share where she's going on vacation, and let alone what she's feeling in the here and now with the patient. I mean, my work is so much about the here and now. It's very much informed by my patients' histories, and including their childhood traumas. But it's very much about the here and now. It's very much about our relationship in the here and now. It's an intersubjective relational analytic approach. And I know that's a lot of syllables, but I'll be happy to try to explain them to the best of my ability if that would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense to do so now, and I'll let go of my attachment to that story. Maybe we'll get to it, maybe we won't, but it makes sense to elaborate on. Did you say intersubjective?
I'll do my best to explain two very complicated psychoanalytic approaches, but I'd be happy to preface it with that story if you'd like me to. I'm more than happy to do that, of this the story from when I was a young adult in my early 20s, before I found a therapist who was really helpful to me.
Mm-hmm.
So he came a lot closer to being helpful than this series of therapists that I saw for single consultations and left in tears. So I'm not saying I made it easy for the poor guy, because I was so enmeshed with my mother at the time that I basically told him, this is not going to work out if you criticize my mother. So, my mother raised me to be very enmeshed with her.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, I was putting the therapist in a no-win situation. Um, so, but one thing that was disturbing, well, on the one hand, you mentioned positive regard. And, I think a lot of us, even if we haven't trained in Rogerian technique, we understand that the patient needs to experience a feeling of warmth and love, which is the real four-letter word in our field, and I'll get to that.
Yes.
And acceptance. And the reason I say it's a four-letter word, and there's a lot of threads, and maybe we won't get to all of them, and that's okay on my end. Hopefully it is on yours and the audience's as well. We live in a very love and sex phobic society. It manifests itself in terms of sex phobia. And, we saw a lot of acceptance of LGBTQ people. We're seeing a lot. I mean, never in a million years did I think that Congress would actually support same-sex marriage after the courts affirmed the right, and not support a woman's right to choose, which is a whole other topic. I mean, like, I oh my God, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that. But we're seeing such a backlash against transgender. And, I'm sure you read about this horrible incident of this apparently very, very sweet non-binary individual who was killed by bullies in her school. I don't know if you read about that in the Times or elsewhere.
No, please. I haven't, but and maybe listeners have, but maybe some listeners haven't. So please elaborate.
Well, I don't remember what state it was in.
When did it happen?
Very recently.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even less than a week ago.
Okay.
And apparently this student was bullied and died from the damage during the bullying, simply because they were non-binary. And apparently, I mean, if you look at photos of this person and you hear testimony about, from people who knew this person, apparently this person was like a very gentle and sweet kid who was fucking killed for being non-binary. So, we live in a very love and sex phobic culture. And in my field particularly, I mean, psychoanalysis has done more, I think, and this is said with all respect to IFS, which I think is a wonderful approach. And my beloved sister is an IFS therapist.
Is that right?
As you are. But I do have a particular allegiance to psychoanalysis, and my own view is that it can go deeper than any other approach, and we certainly don't need to agree about that. And I have a lot of respect for IFS, but psychoanalysis was born out of a lot of boundary violations. Freud developed his seduction theory. He was seeing a lot of patients who were sexually abused by their family members, and he got a lot of pushback from people who did not like the idea that a lot of these upright Victorian fathers were molesting their daughters. And and I believe that this is what was really happening. But he got a lot of pushback from colleagues. There was a huge furor, and of course, he was already in a very difficult position as a Jew in an anti-Semitic culture, and he abandoned the seduction theory and decided, and this led to the creation of the Oedipus complex. And so that's part of what I mean by boundary violations. But some of his colleagues, some of the great people in the field, like Carl Jung, whom I have a tremendous respect for, because I'm one of the few non-Jungian psychoanalysts who's spiritually inclined, and I respect him tremendously. But you know, there's a fairly recent film, and I say fairly recent, within the last 10 years, about his affair with one of his patients.
Right.
And I don't know if you're familiar with Anna Nin, the great autobiographer. She had an affair with Otto Rank, who was her analyst, and who was here in the United States, and who was the psychoanalyst who repudiated Freud's wonderful theory of innate bisexuality, the idea that to some extent we're all bisexual. And his views led to the pathologization of homosexuality in America, because Europe never viewed homosexuality pejoratively the way we did. So there's you know, and then of course we, you know, more recently in this country, we learned about how many kids were getting molested in schools. And it led to the opposite extreme, where now a teacher's afraid to hug a young student who really needs a hug.
Yeah.
So in my discipline of psychoanalysis, you know, there are all these debates about whether it's okay to tell your patient that you love them.
Yeah. No. It's...
And I use the word quite liberally. I'm cautious with some people who have had their boundaries violated, or people who have been so put down that to say something positive about them feels uncomfortable. But I believe that love really heals. And I'm a Gemini, so I'm probably going all over the place.
You and I both. You and I both.
That's why we connect so well. So I don't know if I'm going to get back to other threads, but you seem to be on the same page as me that it's not the end of the world if we don't get back to all the threads.
That's right. Let me pause you though for a second, because there are some threads I want to pick up on here. Just with
thank you for doing that, because I'm enjoying this so much, and I'm just going to allow you to be responsible for us getting back to whatever threads we need to get back to.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how strong working memory is here. With seduction theory, one of the things that I was, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but I was curious if it incorporates when Freud is imagining or theorizing that, you know, well, let me just cut to the chase. If the father's molesting the daughter, is part of seduction theory incorporating what happened to the father when the father was prepubescent or postpubescent? I mean, like any, in other words, like there's a concept in IFS called perpetrator. Well, I guess it's not IFS, perpetrator introject. I can't remember what other model is. The idea that like you as an individual can be the survivor, the victim of a perpetrator that commits a harm to you. You take in the perpetrator's energy, and then you displace, you recreate that perpetrator energy into the next person. I mean, the Catholic Church would be a perfect example of this with regards to molestation. A boy that's molested becomes a priest and molests the next boy, and on and on and on ad infinitum. It's just one example, but it happens all the time, this phenomena. So I'm just curious if seduction theory ever got a one step up in the generation of these dads are molesting their daughters. Did seduction theory ever look at what happened to the dads when they were young?
So that's a wonderful question, and while you were formulating it, you did a great job of showing a lot of the connections between IFS and psychoanalytic theory. And introject is a psychoanalytic term, and there's a lot of overlap between IFS and certain psychoanalytic approaches. So it never got to that point
Okay.
because Freud was not even able to hold on to his idea that it was happening at all, let alone that it was that there was an intergenerational transmission of trauma. But more recently, psychoanalysts have been writing about that. And but there was another thread in psychoanalysis with Sándor Ferenczi in Hungary, and he never abandoned the idea that these patients were actually molested, that it wasn't just a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in some ways he's considered the grandfather of relational psychoanalysis, which is, we talked about possibly my doing my best to explain relational and intersubjective, which are very complicated concepts, but I can do my best. I probably should have thought more about this
All
before
good.
our interview. But
Can I interrupt you for just a
please,
second though?
please, you can interrupt me anytime you
Yeah.
want.
You and I have very high thresholds for being interrupted. I tell my couples when I work with them, I'm like, you can interrupt me, but not each other. You're welcome to interrupt me. The other thing I wanted to just pick up on before we get too much distance from it was this idea of sexuality, and that indeed everyone is. I'm thinking of Kinsey, of course. This continuum, and every single human being falls on a continuum of sexuality. In my view, this makes a lot of sense, not just with sexuality, but also with gender identity.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason why it makes sense to me is because when I go inside of my own system, or when I am allowed to learn more about someone else going inside their system, we find parts that are non-gendered, as well as the same gender that the person identifies with, as well as the opposite gender that the person identifies with. So for example, you take a guy like me, heterosexual male, it doesn't mean all my parts are heterosexual males. My parts, now I said heterosexual. I have yet to encounter a part of me that has any other kind of a sexual orientation, but I have female parts. I have male parts, female parts, and parts that don't have any gender. They're more of an energy. They, or at least they show themselves that way. So I get that back to, like, we all fall somewhere on the continuum, and that continuum is also not static necessarily.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, we may both be Geminis, but I think my sexual orientation is a lot more fluid than yours, because while I very much identify as gay, male, non-binary, I find women extremely attractive.
Uh-huh.
And, I think that this is what was so wonderful about Freud's theory of innate bisexuality, and Kinsey's continuum. And you mentioned parts, and parts is actually a psychoanalytic term back from object relations theory back in the 30s and moving forward. And I can see what I'm talking about. So I think it's more than a continuum. I think it's more than sexual orientation and gender identity. I think there are as many genders, sexual orientations, races, ethnicities, abilities, spiritualities, including atheism and agnosticism, as there are people on the planet.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that they do shift. Of course, the danger in acknowledging that is you get people who view homosexuality as a choice or as a lifestyle. And most of us do not experience frequent changes in our sexual orientation. So then you can have certain people who are more conservatively inclined or more more fundamentalist in their religious views, who say, well, this is a choice. And then you have Catholics saying homosexuality is intrinsically disordered, which is totally, there's no scientific basis, and it's not reflected in the animal kingdom, and we are animals. And you'll have somebody as relatively enlightened as Pope Francis saying, well, okay, we will bless same-sex couples, but we're not blessing the couple, we're blessing the individuals.
Hmm.
So, but I agree with you so strongly. It's just that unfortunately people can manipulate some of these things to serve their ends, and to put people into boxes and to restrict people's humanity and agency.
Well, that's right. It's exactly what I was thinking. Put people. I mean, it's in a sense. I don't know. Maybe it's an evolutionary payoff to be able to, like when you see a snake, you can just there's a fast track to just jump on top of your parents' shoulders and get away from the snake versus, oh, is that a rope? Is that a snake? What is that? If it takes longer to do it, maybe you're bit and then you win the Darwin Award, right? And you get out of the gene pool. But like I'm thinking it makes sense to me why there would be this functional, like people put the people in boxes, and that's how people make sense of the world. But it's almost kind of self-evident for one to just take away the borders and boundaries and conceptual categories and say, well, kind of self-evident that you would have the continuum or the spectrum of all phenomena, including identities and orientation, like the color spectrum. Like we say, like, well, this is someone can't really tell the difference between two shades of yellow. They just say those are both the same shade of yellow, when in fact they're not. They're not. They're just phenomenologically different shades of yellow.
There are probably as many yellows as there are people on the
Yeah,
planet.
exactly.
But I want to circle back to what you were talking about the function of categorizations. And there was a time in our history when you had to know whether you were Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon man, or woman, because you had to, in some way it seemed linked to survival, although we've actually learned that there was a huge amount of intermarriage between those two subspecies. And I think that, so there's a very primitive reaction on the part of some people with more fundamentalist beliefs who are threatened by the other and by difference. In some ways, it goes along with our reptilian brain, it goes along with evolution. But I don't think it's coincidental now that we're seeing much more outness about varying sexual orientations, gender identities, races, and ethnicities. Because I think if we're going to survive as a species, we're going to have to embrace diversity. And if we go back into our reptilian brain and go back into our fears and go back into our blacks and whites, we're not going to survive as a species.
Yeah. I agree with you, and I think it does. Survival requires, I don't know, you can kind of take things as, well, what I was about to say to finish my sentence was requires open-mindedness, humility, curiosity, so that we don't unintentionally jettison very valuable components that could lead to the survivability of our species. And yet also things can go extreme. I'm thinking now politically in terms of just borders, for example, right? Like if you go too extreme with borders, now you've cut off valuable, there's no porosity of a nation state, and you've cut off valuable resources that can come in, not to mention wildlife that migrates and now they die because they can't migrate or whatever. You can get extreme openness of boundaries, and now you can say, well, like, I'm just going to put everything in my mouth and now I get a disease and die. So these things can kind of, I don't know if I'm making sense coherently, but
you're making perfect sense. But I'd much rather we err on the side of openness and letting people in, whether it's migrants or or the people that we work with. I was working with a patient today who also had yet another patient who had a series of consultations and negative experiences with therapists. This patient was told that their sadness was too much. And one of the therapists who told her this had worked with her for a number of years. I mean, that just makes me so, I was going to say angry, but for some reason I'm feeling more bewildered. Like, what kind of a therapist could tell their patient that anything they're feeling is too much. And the stereotype is that for you're somebody else in the field, and I don't know whether everybody listening is in the field, but the stereotype is a lot of us don't want to deal with our patient's anger. I'm more used to saying, oh, well, that patient's anger was too much. They attacked me, and which I actually think sometimes when a patient attacks me, they're finally feeling safe enough
Yes,
for their anger.
that's
But
right.
can you imagine that this therapist who had seen this patient for years told her that her sadness was too much? Now, it's okay if she felt that way. And again, I'm all for openness, and I disclose far more than the average bear. But can you imagine? I mean, tell me, don't tell your fucking patient your sadness is too much.
I want to give that provider I want to give that provider a little leeway and a little bit of benefit of the doubt. And I wonder if they really just meant to, if I could clean it up a little, if they really meant to say, it seems as though the sadness is too much to bear, right? Because that's different than it is too much. It seems as though it's too much to bear. That still allows room for hope and room for the capability for a person to hold their sadness in a compassionate way.
I love your open-mindedness and your willingness to give the therapist the benefit of the doubt. I'm not being, even though you're laughing, I didn't mean it ironically.
No, I know you didn't. I know you didn't. Yeah.
But it was very, and that, that would have been a very different statement.
Yes, it would have been.
It was crystal clear that that's not what the statement was, and that it was a replication of the patient's experience with her mother, who could not deal with her feelings and told her she was too sad, she was too angry, she was too this, and she was too that. And it didn't just happen with this one therapist. She was told by 7 therapists that she was too sad.
You think the provider identified with the projection, back to kind of object relations theory, that the provider was becoming the mom that couldn't bear the sadness?
Absolutely. And it's fine if that's happening within the provider, even if the provider's not aware of it. It's fine if the provider doesn't act it out. I'm thinking back to my second year of social work school.
We got some freezing here. Say, I'm thinking, I just lost you at second year of social work.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to my second year of social work school, and I was working at a psychotherapy clinic for LGBT people. And my supervisor was observing me do an intake with a patient, and I was very uncomfortable about that. I wasn't comfortable with his, when I say observing, I mean, he was in the room with me. Now, if I had an established relationship with him and I was very comfortable with him, that would have been fine with me. But this was my very, very first encounter with a psychotherapy patient. And the supervisor, whom I didn't know, was in the room with me.
No pressure.
No pressure. The patient comes in, and I have these questions I'm supposed to ask on the intake. The patient's suicidal. Now, my natural inclination would be to completely forget about the questions for the intake and just be there for the person. But because my supervisor was there, I went ahead with the questions. He took over the intake, which is, that's fine. That's what the patient needed. But then in the supervision session, he told me I was too anxious. Now, the reason I'm laughing is it's like, what kind of a budding therapist would I have been if I didn't feel anxious? I don't even mean because I was new. I mean, because, when we talk about using countertransference as a tool, and I know you know what I'm talking about, what kind of a therapist would have I have been if I didn't feel anxious with that patient? I was supposed to feel anxious with that patient. And get this was a psychoanalytic therapist.
Yeah.
So it just reminds me of this patient. I almost said poor patient, but she's not a poor patient, who was told over and over that she was too sad. And I said to her today, you're not a poor patient. You know, you're a survivor. You found a way to survive your family and survive these therapists till you got to me. And I'm so gratified and grateful that you found a way to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. How did she receive that when you authentically opened your heart in that way and expressed it?
Well, I think she really appreciated it, and I think she likes me a great deal, but I'm still new to her and she's been badly burned.
Yeah.
So I think, I think she appreciated it. She teared up a little, but I don't think it had the kind of impact that it would have if she knew me better and knew that I wasn't just words.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
That's,
she has to get to know to see whether my actions follow my words, because I'm sure you've experienced a lot of people in and out of the field who have lovely words and then their actions don't always follow them.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. I wanna ask you a question connected to something you shared many minutes ago at this point, but it seems relevant just in the flow and cadence of what we're saying here with regards to what heals. You said love, and
That's
it's this,
it.
you're talking about a new patient, and so the trust is in the process of being earned. And it's like, can I really trust that you are authentic and sincere, even though part of that patient was tearing up and was being moved and felt that connection and that care. um I want to ask you, Jonathan, to elaborate on the claim that love is what heals people. I know that's a big question, but I want to, it's relevant because I don't know that I I don't know that every school of therapy or therapy modality gets in that same boat. But
Absolutely not, including most of my colleagues in psychoanalysis. I'm going to stand up for that question. I have a standing desk, and I love
awesome.
it.
Yes, I'm so glad you're using that feature right now.
My butt gets tired, and I stand up, and my feet get tired, and I sit down. It's so wonderful.
Will you still need me? Will you still feed me? Will I have a standing desk when I'm 64? I hope so. I hope so. I
Which is
hope I'll
my
get one
exact.
before.
I don't know if you remember this, but that's my exact age.
Yeah, no,
So,
that's, yeah.
so even if you didn't remember it consciously, you did unconsciously.
You told me
Um,
64. That's, I associated to the Beatles song. Yeah, Dan Siegel, though, I went to a training and Dan Siegel was attending the training, and not only did he have a standing desk, he was on like a treadmill or whatever, like like I can walk while I work. And I was like,
I'm
that's
so
badass.
glad you shared that with me, because I've toyed with that idea, and I think, but maybe that would be too distracting to my patients. But it's also interesting because my husband is 13 years older than me,
Hmm.
but I'm the one feeding him. But not that he hasn't worked for years, but he's not working anymore, and I'm working my butt off, which I'm actually thrilled to do. But to get back to your question about love,
Yeah.
and I already shared how there's a lot of controversy about to what extent do you let your patients know that you love them. But I think even the folks who would never share that with their patient, I think most of them would agree that if in some way the patient doesn't feel you're caring from you, that no matter how brilliant an interpretation you make, or no matter how adept you are at helping them identify their protective and persecuting parts, um, that that not much is going to happen.
Hmm.
And one of the disturbing things about um, the trend towards teaching almost exclusively kind of behavioral approaches in social work and psychology programs. And I think this is less of a problem in counseling and marriage and family therapy programs, which tend to be more eclectic. But one of the problems with this switch towards manualized CBT approaches is that there's not a lot of room and training for how do you help patients to see that you care. But I actually think that many of our patients were really deprived of love in their families. And if you're not going to tell them you love them, they better feel it from you, or they're not going to make a lot of progress.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the earlier, I've been doing this for about 10 years. And one of the patterns I've noticed when I ask feedback, what was helpful, not in the old days as a trainee where it's like every damn session, the session evaluation questionnaire, what was helpful, what was but
Oh,
at discharge, right? When we're wrapping up our work, when we're bringing it in for a landing, and what was useful, I started to notice the pattern that people would say again and again is that, that you cared, that you cared. And so it should be no surprise to listeners that I agree with this claim. To me, it doesn't feel like a claim. It feels just very true, that it doesn't require evidence to substantiate it. But to the skeptic, it is I mean, you know who Frank Anderson is?
name's familiar.
He's one of the prescribing he's a psychiatrist who's very much in like leadership positions in the IFS community. He's a well-known IFS guy. He'll be at
That's why his name is familiar. I
yeah.
think I actually saw. I think I actually did a CE thing that he led.
Yeah, he'll be at the Psychotherapy Networker in DC next month. And I mean, his thing is love heals trauma. Love heals the trauma. The trauma is the separation, the breaking apart of your wholeness, and love kind of restores it. And when the client can't access love for themselves, they can't access it when the therapist can offer them that love. Again, whether they say it explicitly doesn't matter. It's the energetic transmission of the undeniable fact that, oh, you do care. You do have this very palpable compassion for me. When the client feels the provider's compassion, it's magical. It unlocks compassion inside of the client that was always there, right? Like a seed that didn't have any water yet, and then that compassion kind of waters the seed and it blossoms and grows, and their own organic, natural, innate birthright of compassion inside of themselves can start to resonate just like a tuning fork, and that
I love the way you said that. But my husband is a minister, and I'm reluctant to say this because it didn't sound preachy at all, but it sounded like a passion. It sounded like a passionate sermon in a positive way.
yeah.
There was a lot of passion in what she said. I definitely agree about the energy. I'm not convinced that it doesn't need to be said. I'm not convinced that it doesn't need to be said. But a lot of studies, not everybody's going to be comfortable saying or hearing "I love you." There are other ways of saying that. So I'm sure you know that a lot of studies have demonstrated empirically that it's the relationship
Oh yeah.
which is most curative, regardless of your theoretical approach. And relational psychoanalysis is all about the healing power of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it started from an integration in, I think, 1979 by Steve Mitchell and Jay Greenberg, of object relations and interpersonal approaches, because object relations had this very rich internal life. We were talking about parts, introjects, and this very rich internal life, but object relations didn't have an interpersonal element. It was all about what happens inside of the patient. It was a British approach, and the American approach was interpersonal, with Harry Stack Sullivan and his followers.
Mhm.
Harry Stack Sullivan said, "We are all more simply human than otherwise," which is one of my favorite quotations. And but that approach was very much about, if I'm an analyst and you're my patient, we're not just working with what's going on inside of you. There's a relationship between us, and there's also what's going on inside of me.
Yeah.
But there's very much a relationship between us, an interpersonal relationship. And some followers, like Eric Fromm, even brought the social into it, which is, of course, very important today as we're struggling with issues of race and racism, as well as differing sexual orientations and gender identities. So object relations was basic. Mitchell and Greenberg came from an interpersonal background, but they really saw a great deal of richness in object relations. So they integrated the two of them. And intersubjective, there's some overlap because Jessica Benjamin is a great relational intersubjectivist. It gets very confusing with all these highfalutin terms. And Thomas Ogden is a great British object relations intersubjectivist. But the mainstream of intersubjective theory is based on self-psychology, which has to do with the need to have a cohesive sense of self, which is very important for trauma survivors and of course for any human being. And it's very much about the relationship between analyst and patient. And I would say that there's a slight difference in relational. There's almost an equal focus on what is going on in the head of my patient or in the heart of my patient and what's going on inside of me. Whereas intersubjective is very much acknowledging what's going on inside of me, but the focus is more on what's going on inside of the patient. And my two mentors, who I think I mentioned, but perhaps not by name, Arthur Gray is a wonderful Black self-psychologist with an intersubjective approach, and I'm in his training group for group therapists. And I'm also in a training group with Richard Billow, which happened right before we met today.
Mm.
He's very much of a relational psychoanalyst, and they have even though when I described it, they may sound similar, they have very different approaches. It gets a challenge for me sometimes as a member of the groups to integrate the two different approaches, but I just get so much from each one of those approaches, and both of them have very much influenced how I work with patients.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't help but think about when you were describing the relationship between the provider and the client, how, yeah, there's stuff going on in the client, there's stuff going on in the provider, and how that stuff in each entity is exchanged and interacting all as grits for the mill in terms of what allows for a successful transformation and healing, or not, right? And I couldn't help but think back to your early experience with this guy with the cigar, and the fact that what was going on inside of him came out into the public space,
Yeah.
consensus reality, right? It came out into that, and then stirred up stuff in you, which is like, not safe. I'm out of here. You know what I mean? So it's
And I really appreciate your saying that. I mean, what you just did with me was actually rather healing for me, because
more.
I saw myself more as this poor kid, but you helped me to see just now that I was also asserting my agency by, I felt like I had to leave, but no, I was choosing to leave.
Absolutely. So that's clear for me, but I hear your point that it's a new angle on the event now.
I think if I were my own patient, I mean, I could see that in a patient, but this is what happened to me. And so I wasn't able to see it the same way. And it's also something that happened many years ago before I knew about some of what we're discussing. So I just wanted to give you credit for helping me to see that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I obviously couldn't have known unless you said it out loud. But I mean, this is to me, I don't know, that the agency that you're talking about is, when we learn to not take things personally, it's becomes rather easy to kind of commend someone for their the positive intention behind their actions, right? Like, so if we're a new therapist and our client fires us, what does the new trainee usually do? Like, oh, what could I have done differently? Like, why I feel like I failed them. I didn't. All sorts of stories come up, and yet if you don't take it personally, it's like something wasn't working, and good for them for firing you. Like, good for them for having that. Now,
But
again, you could take another angle and say they're running away from their.
no, no, no,
Yeah,
no.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's interesting you should say that in relation to a neophyte, because I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I think it took me a long time to get to the point of like, good for them, but still feeling regret about ways that I may have failed them or fucked up.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, well, that's human nature. That's what I mean. Like, again, in my camp of parts, it's like, oh, the parts have every right to take it personally, and I'm not even going to ask them to think otherwise. They can feel like it's my fault. Excuse me, but that they're not me. And that's going to maybe bridge us to something that I've been meaning to ask you follow up on, which is on my side of the computer monitor, of course, I'm thinking here, sitting and believing IFS that's what will take you to the deepest and strangest waters. And Jonathan said, I think the psychoanalytic is the deepest. And so I want to come back to that, which is, I'm just very curious about, I'm a fan of Jung, and I haven't read his Red Book yet. But it's when people talk about the weirder stuff that people write about, I'm like, I want to read that. Because I don't immediately cast it out and just, I want to see what this person's trying to put together or make connections with. And Jung was very how should we say, not well accepted or mainstream. I mean, they don't teach Jung in social work programs, do they? They certainly didn't teach
Oh
Jung
my God.
in MFT programs.
Forget about Jung. I mean, they barely teach psychodynamic of any kind now in
They,
social work
oh,
programs.
in social
It's
work, okay.
almost in social work and psychology. Most social work and psychology programs are almost exclusively CBT.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, and look, there's a place for look, our military, that's the gold standard, and yet in Western medicine, it's not the whole picture. I have Norm Epstein is one of the godfathers in the CBT field, and MFT wrote the book for couples therapy for CBT. But CBT, I have as much respect as I have for it. It's kind of like going to a vegan restaurant and you're like, but I need red blood cell. I need animal fat and meat and protein and iron. I can't go to this vegan place and get the whole nutritional palette. Okay. So maybe a clumsy metaphor, but it's the first one that came to me, right? Which is the idea that CBT doesn't paint with all the colors, and it misses something that Western medicine will fail people if we don't zoom back and open up our minds and our hearts to the possibility that the person has a lot more wisdom than you're giving them credit for. And if you just treat them through a CBT lens, you may be missing something really significant that's not going to change otherwise, unless you put down your CBT theories and get curious and get humble,
and it doesn't necessarily mean I just want to quickly respond to the analogy
Oh, yeah.
about veganism, which
I knew I was going to get in trouble.
I can understand where you're coming from, but as a person who's vegan in his home, but sometimes ovo-lacto vegetarian outside, I was just laughing because it's fine that you said it. I just have a very different personal experience, but I actually can still appreciate the analogy that you're making. It's not necessarily putting down CBT. I remember when I lived, I'm in New Jersey now, but I lived all over. And I remember years ago when I lived in New York, and I had formed some peer consultation groups. And I remember that some of the members of these groups were CBT folks, but they also they had learned a lot about psychodynamic, and they really understood about transference and countertransference. And they also, they understood that some people need short-term work and some people need long-term work, but that even when you work short-term, if you're going to be really effective, you need to have an understanding of transference and countertransference. I still remember being at these CE events with a lot of CBT folks saying, I gave them the homework assignment and they didn't do it, and it's like, I just think there's a terrible, terrible loss. And again, this may not be the case as much in MFT and counseling programs, but in terms of social work and psychology, that therapists in training are not learning about transference and countertransference, and what a loss that is for them, and what a loss it's going to be for their patients, until they realize they really do need to learn about this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Jonathan, come back to my question about depth, and tell me more about how psychoanalysis, in your opinion and in your view, can bring the human experience as deep as we know, uncharted waters.
So before I answer that,
Sure.
I just want to say I have complete respect for you. It's IFS, and I think for most of us, we are wounded healers. We've had our own therapy. I can say for myself, my own therapy experiences have been the best learning experience for me, other than my experience of treating patients and what I've learned from them and myself in working with them. So I'm not going to ask you about your own therapy. I'm guessing you had some very positive IFS experiences, and that's what informs your belief that you can go farthest with it. For myself, having started with when I finally had a good therapist, the one who helped me enough that I wanted to become one, he was actually a Gestalt therapist, which is a psychodynamic approach, but it's definitely not psychoanalytic. And I started working with an analytic therapist, and I started training as an analyst, and I had to switch training analysts, which was a very difficult experience. I think just from my own experience, the degree to which I've been able to heal from my trauma and to integrate what I've learned, I don't know that I could do that with any other approach. And maybe I'll go out on a limb. I don't know anywhere near as much about IFS as you do. But the sense I get is that there's a belief in IFS that maybe I'm going on too much of a limb here, but I'll try to go ahead. There's a belief, and I love so much about what I know about IFS, but there's a belief that the persecutory parts have a protective function, which I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I also think that evil exists in the world, and you might agree with me that as a spiritual person,
100%,
that evil exists in the world, and there's a way in which I think psychoanalysis deals with. There's some overlap with IFS in terms of how the parts within us develop the way they did, and how can we work with those parts towards healing. But I'm one of these odd ducks who isn't just relational and intersubjective, but I believe that Freud was right, that there is such a thing as a death instinct. I don't see how you can explain what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine right now without believing that there's something innately destructive about people that we need to resist. That being said, why do I think that psychoanalysis can go deeper than any other approach? I guess you might agree with me, as much as you love IFS. I'm wondering, how far would you be able to go with your patients if you only dealt with IFS principles and you didn't deal with the transference and countertransference, which is a psychoanalytic approach? I don't know how deep you'd be able to go if you didn't integrate IFS with those psychoanalytic principles. And I think any work that's going to go deep needs to deal with transference and countertransference.
And let me just and I appreciate everything you're saying. And let me just say that I was a supervision junkie as a trainee. Say I had a morning supervisor, a nighttime supervisor. There were adjunct supervisors that like, I'm a supervisor in training and I need a supervisee so I can get my supervision hours. And I was like, yo, over here, like give me as many perspectives as I can get.
Lucky for your patience.
I guess so. Well, my story is that the adjunct, her name is Patrizia Polaro. One day I'm going to get her on the podcast. She was she's still a dear friend of mine and a mentor of mine, and she taught me next to everything I know about psychodynamic and object relations models and countertransference. I felt as an MFT very lucky because there wasn't a lot. She was the guest speaker that came in on the week that we were going to learn, psychodynamic or object relations. So I felt like I had a little bit more of an appreciation for what's going on with countertransference as a trainee than my counterparts in the program at that time. But IFS, countertransference, is the word to say IFS drops a nuclear bomb on countertransference and blows it apart, not to get rid of it, but to see it for in higher resolution for what it's really going on. So countertransference is all of the parts of the provider. Me, Robin, when I'm sitting with my clients, it is the countertransference in one view. In IFS language, it's all of my parts, my well-meaning clinician parts that know all the theories and techniques and the interventions that get in the way or that get activated by what a client says. That's the stuff that's getting in the way. And I say getting in the way kind of functionally, not to badmouth them, but when my parts can separate and relax, which is all the things that are contributing from a countertransference perspective that contribute to not effective psychotherapy, but the lack thereof, that get in the way of effective healing. When all that relaxes, that's where the healing can actually be most effective. So it's not a part of Robin that's doing the work. It's what's called self. Jung was the capital S self, or from a spiritual perspective, the Holy Spirit. I'm the Robin flesh body. That's the vessel that allows self energy to embody me and then show up and be there for the client in a healing way that helps unlock self inside of them. So simply put, countertransference is IFS is like countertransference on steroids, and it's not getting rid of countertransference. It is integrating the principles of countertransference, but it's looking at it through the lens of, hey, the therapist has all these personalities and these different parts also that are well-meaning and but do get in the way and don't do effective work. Don't do as good of a job as self, which we all have. We all have self. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think I agree with you about that. Although, these two mentors I mentioned, that they wouldn't agree with that at all. They're not at all spiritually oriented.
Yeah.
And yet they do this incredible work that I don't see how they're able to do that without a connection to what I see as a God. But that's a whole other thing. I think what you said is very interesting, about considering the different parts of the therapist. But I wonder to what extent you're familiar with the idea of using your countertransference in the service of okay. I just
yes, exactly.
Sure
Exactly. So using the countertransference, if I translate that to IFS terms, it's the parts of Robin that are getting activated or triggered or getting very loud and telling me things or showing me things or making sensations in my chest or my gut or whatever. They're the wise advisors. They're the ones letting me know, hey, this is going on, but they're still not taking over the wheel. I'm in the lead and I'm driving the bus. So they're my passengers. And so they counsel me and advise me as to what's going on. They can make connections and they have different specializations and specialties. Like a logical part is not going to be very helpful in navigating emotional waters. And an emotional part is not going to be very helpful in helping me to speak the language of someone who's very logically oriented. So they're there and they can influence what's going on, but at a distance and not by hijacking or taking over. In IFS terms, it would be blending, or like a part as a almost like spirit possession, like they just take over me.
Right.
Yeah. So
No, I understand everything you're saying, but I'm not, and maybe you're understanding everything I'm saying too, but I just want to make sure I'm being clear that, I mean, did you learn at all about concordant and complementary countertransference, Racker's work from the late 60s?
No.
So he was one of the great pioneers of the idea that countertransference doesn't have to be a hindrance, that it can be a help. And so in concordant countertransference, if we make believe for a moment, you're my patient, and I suddenly start feeling angry, if it's a concordant countertransference, in some way I'm getting a sense of what you're feeling or how you experience yourself. Whereas if it were a complementary countertransference, I might be feeling what your rage that a parent felt towards you, for example. So then it can help me have a better understanding of where your anger is coming from. So even though you may not have known the terms, the ideas may be very familiar to you. So I just wanted to check that out.
Yeah, no, and that all makes sense. And again, it makes sense from the standpoint of the clinician or the provider is experiencing phenomenology and then is able to utilize that felt experience to guide the flow in a helpful way. I mean, that's
we're on the same page. I'm getting a notice that my internet connection is unstable. So that might be why.
I got that notice earlier on my side. I don't usually,
Okay.
literally my router is in this office. So usually it's not an issue, but it hasn't been too bad. There's only that one part that was choppy and I got us back on track. Let me ask about, evil is actually really, compelling. That grips me. Is the way you work, or can you speak to a psychoanalytic framework that can help to heal evil?
Oh boy. I wish I could speak a lot more eloquently to it. I just think that, and I think IFS has a great deal to contribute in terms of the parts work. But I think that the more we can become aware of our unconscious motivations, especially I don't want to say darker, because I don't like using light as positive and dark as
I
negative.
understand.
I feel like it contributes to the whole racism problem.
I get
But
it.
as we become more aware of our unconscious motivations, some of which may not be explicitly evil, but which may be selfish or destructive in some way, we're much less likely to act it out. I mean, Vladimir Putin had a very difficult childhood. I mean, he really did, and Russia went through a great deal. And I think if he had a really good analyst, that maybe the war wouldn't be happening in Ukraine. That being said, that's a lot of my contemporary colleagues who don't believe in Freud's death instinct. I think something is missing. When we look at the wide scale destruction, but to really answer your question in a practical way, it's not just about what can individual clinicians do to help individual patients. We have a problem with systems, with governmental systems. Before we were talking about boundaries and talking about them not only in terms of within ourselves, but also between and among ourselves, and even within and between countries. And and as I said, I tend to err on the favor of opening rather than closing. And again, it seems to me that if we don't find a way to unite with other countries, let alone unite within our own country, the survival of our species may be doomed. So we could talk about about ways that that psychoanalysis can help people become aware of how they may be self-destructive or destructive of others and less likely to act it out. But we're also working within a system that makes it very difficult for people to afford deeper forms of therapy. You know, and IFS is also a deeper form of therapy, and it's not a short-term quick fix. We live in a society that makes that very difficult for people to afford. And we need to change our systems. You were using the term provider, and I, I part of me was like, part of me was uncomfortable with your doing that. Part of me actually likes the term provider because it has the word provide in it,
Uh-huh.
and I do feel like I provide something to my patients. But part of it was bothered by it, and I know this is not who you are. I can tell it's not who you are at all. But you know, it's very much of a term that was invented in the context of managed care, and
Yep.
you know, I get, you know, I get the sense that you're a lot younger than me, but you may have still been around in the days when managed care first started, and there, you know, insurance benefits used to be very generous, and there used to be a lot of indemnity plans that would pay 80% of the cost of treatment, and treatment could be long term. And in managed care, they start. I mean, to me, that phrase is such an oxymoron. How can you manage
Yeah.
care? And in fact, they found that they were paying all this money to these care managers, and it wasn't making treatment more efficient. But we still live in a system that privileges short-term, less deep forms of treatment. So I don't. The last thing I would want you to do is censor yourself, and you can go on using the word provider. But I did want to share that you know, it brought up for me some 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 disturbing associations for me.
You're very, by the way, Jonathan, you're very right that provider. I probably actually didn't even start to use the word provider until I began to accept Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? like it's just I'm absorbing it in the paperwork and all that stuff. But from the IFS view, it's very much like the client heals themselves. So it's not, I'm not, I as the therapist am not necessarily providing them anything other than open space for the world, humble curiosity and loving compassion that is kind of titrated at a respectful way. Like we don't just force our caregiving onto someone because we want them to get better as soon as possible, right? We respect their autonomy and their agency and their boundaries. And so yeah, if I'm providing anything in my role as the therapist, I'm providing the space for, you know, for that curiosity and that compassion, and sometimes even, you know, confident clarity, especially working with couples, like needing to actually stop an interaction or you know, even suggest maybe we're not ready for conjoint sessions. I mean, that's not curiosity acting out, and that's not necessarily, even though it has a compassionate instinct, there's another quality that's being provided as well. But your point is well taken in
Oh,
terms of
and I felt safe making it because I knew that you would take it well.
oh
That's
yeah,
my sense of who you are as a person.
yeah.
Um, so as I was listening to you, I was thinking, I wonder if another, you know, even though there's overlap between our two approaches, and I certainly respect yours a great deal, I wonder if there's another point of departure when you say that you're facilitating the client's healing of their own self. And you know, I recently worked with a spiritual director for a while, and she very much believed that we have the tools to heal ourselves, particularly if we connect with spirit with a capital S or God or whatever word you know you use. Um,
Yeah.
but my belief is actually a little different from that, and maybe that's a point of departure in our approaches, which might be interesting to discuss, because I think there's a lot of truth in that, but I also think I need to give something to my patients that they might not be able to give. to themselves. And this is not necessarily a point of departure, because earlier on we were talking about patients needing to hear our caring.
Yes.
And, and I wanted to say, well, that gives the lie to the popular expression, you have to love yourself before you can love somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I might be on the same page as that, but we might differ in terms of, your approach believing in the innate capacity to heal. And I think that in a very intimate psychoanalytic relationship, to use the verb provide again, I think that the psychoanalyst provides something that the patient may need, that's not just about caring, that that may that may not be something. I'm struggling a little bit here, and
Can I jump in?
oh, please.
Yeah, here's the image that comes to my mind. Imagine a guy like yourself is stranded on a desert island, and he's trying to build himself a fire, and he's got the sparks, he's got a little bit of embers, but he's also completely hopeless. Like he's lost hope that he can actually build that fire. And then the therapist washes on shore, comes next to him, and invites him, doesn't compel him or coerce him, invites him to look at the fire together, and says, well, would you be open to seeing what happens if I take this big palm leaf or whatever and start to fan it? And the client says, okay. And then starts to do that. And then and would you like to join me? It's a very simple, I'm reducing it, so we're losing a lot, but then they both start to fan the embers, and then combustion happens, and then a flame comes up. So yes, something is being hope. Certainly hope. The therapist is bringing hope into the system that the client might not otherwise have. Doesn't mean that the spark of healing isn't already in them, but that they might have given up, or they might not. They might have convinced themselves, I'm never going to get off this island because I'm never going to get this fire to light itself, and so we can get the attention of the planes above or whatever, right? So in that analogy, yeah, the therapist is a hope merchant and kind of saying, hey, would you be open to this? Would you be open to looking at it this way? And then that can unlock something that was naturally still they were capable of, but they had given up on, say.
I think you're helping clarify for me where there may be some point of departure,
Sure.
which is that even though I would never want to force something on a patient, the patient does need my authority at times. I don't mean in an authoritarian way.
Sure.
But that there might be things that I know that the patient doesn't know. And that I also think that in some ways, a patient may need a kind of reparenting with me, that they may need the kind of a kind of relationship with me that they didn't get from their parents, that may not be just about love. It may also be about a whole host of other things.
Sure. Yeah, no, totally track and understand what you're saying. And in IFS, the belief is they didn't need the good enough parent, and that the therapist doesn't need to be the good enough parent. Now, the therapist has to be safe, but that the good enough parent is inside, that's the drop of divinity. The good enough parent would be the Godhead inside of them, the Atman, the Buddha nature, the Holy Spirit, etc. And that gets unlocked with the help of the therapist, and that the parts are the ones that carry the traumas, that carry the limiting beliefs, etc. So
yeah, see, I guess I'm still a little bit of an agnostic.
Yeah, totally.
So it's just very interesting.
I'll tell you what, because you've got to get out of here at 10 of, I want to ask you, you will skip the bonus round this time, but this has been such a treat. I want to have you back on, and please come back on. I tend to take a while to get repeat guests. Like sometimes it takes like maybe 2 years, but I don't know, if I get my act together, I'll see you hopefully before then. If you'll come on, but I want to ask you.
I'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really lovely, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I want to ask you the impulsive question of, could you tell, because this isn't just an audio podcast and people can see it, I guess, except for listeners who might be doing laundry or right or working out or something, but the painting in the background, to
Oh,
your left.
mhm.
Yeah. What can you tell me about that?
Well, a patient painted that,
Okay.
and I just thought it was incredibly beautiful and such a it's such an incredible. I don't know if you can still hear me when I turn around and
Yeah.
look at it, but such a wonderful gift. Um, and this patient came from a very an incredibly traumatic background, um, and ended up. We had what seemed to be a breakthrough in terms of his trauma and his disclosing something that he hadn't felt safe disclosing before, and he left treatment. And I wondered whether I had failed him in some way, and I had a lot of I had a lot of mixed feelings about continuing to exhibit the painting
Mm-hmm.
because I still wonder whether I failed him in some way. You know, maybe I pushed him too hard, or but he did give it to me as a gift, and I'm very grateful to him about that. And it's just it's very beautiful. It almost shows a cow or a steer in different phases of evolution, or there's almost like a shadow of a cow that that makes me think about a darker archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really pray that this fellow is okay and that he got the help he needed. And I guess it's some way of embracing my imperfection
Mm-hmm.
and humility by not only having it in my office, but by taking the risk to share that that the treatment wasn't completed,
Mm-hmm.
as when I'm talking to you and knowing that other people are listening. And I think it's incredibly unlikely that he would be listening, but if he is, I'm really hoping he's okay, and he got whatever he needed.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate you sharing all that. And I agree with you. It is beautiful. And that's why I wanted to ask about it. Before you go, you have groups that have openings. Let's talk about where people, because there are listeners all around the country and indeed all
Okay.
around the English speaking world. I had no idea that was going to happen as a podcaster, but that's just how it is. So where are you licensed? So if folks are listening and they want to learn more about you, or even want to reach out to you for a consultation or to join one of your groups, where are you licensed, Jonathan?
Too many states that I can report back to you. I
Yeah.
joke that I'm a one-man interstate compact because the psychologists have had an interstate compact for years, and it's very healthy and strong. And we social workers are always behind them. I actually think MFTs are ahead of us.
I
Um,
don't know about that. I think we're
no,
behind. I think we're behind. I think we're
you
behind.
and
But
I have a compact, or because I know counselors do.
no, we need to get our act together. If we do, I'm not aware of it. But my last I understood is that we don't. But let me. So okay. So if
So
folks want to know,
I'm licensed in a lot of different states, and I sorry, I'm my energy has dropped a little bit, so it's probably just as well that we're stopping soon, although I would love to come back. Um, so I have a group for adults, which is full, and I started a group for early career therapists, which filled up so fast that I decided to form another one for therapists of all experience levels. That's still in the process of formation, and there are some openings in it. I'm also forming a group for survivors of trauma, adult survivors of childhood trauma, which
mhm,
has some openings. Um, I have a peer consultation group, which is full. Um, and I have a little bit room for individuals, couples, or families, but not a lot. But certainly people are welcome to reach out to me at any time. And if I'm not able to help them, I'm happy to try to direct them to somebody who can.
Mm-hmm. And we'll put links in the show notes. But for folks listening, where can they find you to learn more about how to enroll or to get in touch with you for these groups or for services?
Oh, well, I'm assuming you'll put my website um, as a link.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So yes, your website will be in the show notes. Are you on social media at all, Jonathan?
Oh, well, I have a LinkedIn profile, but I kind of block folks from contacting me, and the same thing with Facebook, because before I did that, I mean, I just got thousands of replies, and I couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
I do have a Psychology Today profile, and that's an excellent resource for people who are looking for therapists, because you can set filters. I don't accept insurance, but I file claims for patients. But you can put down what insurance company you have and put your zip code, and you can find. They should really be giving me like some little cut for plugging them like this, like a free month or something. But it is a good tool for people who are looking.
Okay, great. Well, we'll point people in your direction. And Jonathan Lebolt, thanks for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure, and really delightful getting to know you better.